Okay. And then as folks log in, we'll have folks logging in. Um, so welcome. This is our Thinking Tuesday. And see, I said folks will log in and then somebody logged in. So welcome. This is our Thinking Tuesday for December. Um, and because it's topical, it's about Hanukkah, um, sort of, which is to say, we're not really talking too much about Hanukkah. Really, we're really talking about the stuff that the events ultimately caused, um, which is the notion of a genuine end of the world, kind of comes from this time period. So we'll talk about the end of the world a little bit. I mean, the figurative end of the world, because I don't think it works like this, but that's okay. So without much ado, we'll hit on the outlines of the actual Hanukkah story, right? Which we know does not involve oil and uh, 7 days and all of that stuff. And we'll talk about the book of Daniel because this is really where a lot of this stuff comes out of. And we'll talk about what makes apocalyptic literature, which is the section that we're really concerned about from Daniel. What makes apocalyptic literature its own genre? Because it is its own genre of literature moving forward from this point in time, and it appears in Jewish works and it appears in Christian works. And it's a little bit different from some other kinds of material that has apocalyptic content, right? So there's sort of the apocalyptic content, the idea that there's an end of the world, and then there's how apocalyptic literature as a genre functions and why that's really important historically. And that's kind of part of Daniel's legacy because Daniel isn't something that's read in a synagogue, like ever. Um, it's not in the book of the prophets. It's in the three sections of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible. There's the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and Daniel falls into the writings. So Daniel's not part of all of the Haftarot that get read along with Torah portions. Daniel is not one of five books that is read on the afternoons during holidays. And that might be in large part because about half of the book of Daniel's not in Hebrew. Um, it's the only it's the only book of the Bible that's mostly not in Hebrew. There's another one that has some Aramaic sections too, but Daniel is really 50% Aramaic, which by and large people don't know anymore. Um, you don't even necessarily have to learn Aramaic when you go to Orthodox rabbi school. It just isn't really a necessary skill. So it doesn't get read. So it forms a lot less of sort of the stuff that you're likely to encounter, even if you are involved in Orthodox Jewish life, for example. You're just not going to encounter this very often. It doesn't have as many commentaries. It's really not as central. So it sort of becomes less important, except it kind of is really important, at least culturally. So it's worth looking at it just to kind of look at this book. So we'll talk just briefly about the actual Hanukkah story, the parts that are important for Daniel, because there's a lot that's really just not relevant to what's going on with Daniel and what's going on with apocalyptic literature. But we don't really have those bits of culture without Hanukkah. And the Eight Crazy Nights is just a reference to Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song and or, well, he has three Hanukkah songs, right? Um, the three Hanukkah songs, and he did an animated movie called Eight Crazy Nights, which I honestly don't recommend. I didn't think it was really all that interesting or funny, but it's out there and there are reindeer involved, and you can already kind of see it's Adam Sandler, not any officially Jewish kind of thing. Um, so we have this big timeline, and the timeline's important just to kind of understand how we end up with the Maccabean revolt. So, kind of right at the top of the slide, in 323 BCE, Alexander the Great dies, and his empire is divided among four of his generals. And by 302, so about 20 years later, um, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which is centered in Egypt, if you're keeping track at home, Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemies, basically. Um, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt really kind of takes hold of Judea, which is where Jerusalem is and the temple is and all of that other stuff. And they managed to hold it for about 100 years. And then the Seleucid dynasty, which is in Syria, defeats the Ptolemies and takes control of this area. So Antiochus, the bad guy from the Hanukkah story, is a Seleucid. His grandfather is really the person who gets hold of Judea. So it's not very long that all of this is going on. So the Seleucid dynasty takes over. This is like, it's just constant warfare in this area. One of the things to remember about the geography of what we call the land of Israel is the land is actually not particularly worth holding in most cases, right? There's like this agricultural section in the north, but then otherwise the south, nobody wants the south. The south is just desert and rock. And quite frankly, so some of the east. And what you want this land for is not the land itself, but because it's the connector between Africa and Asia Minor. So you want the land, but you don't want the land for the land. So people are always fighting to have control over. If you look at a map of the highways in the United States, you will notice that a whole bunch of them run through Indianapolis. There's no particular reason I can imagine, other than maybe you're from Indiana, to actually want to live in Indianapolis, but the roads go through there, so there's a bunch of trucking companies because it's like there's 5 or 6 interstates that go right through Indianapolis. That's what Indianapolis is good for, warehouses. This is kind of the same deal with Judea and the land of Israel at this point in time. They're always somebody's vassal because they're the place in between. Antiochus IV, who is the bad guy of the Hanukkah story for most of it, becomes head of the Seleucid Empire in 175 BCE, and he continues these kind of tolerant cultural policies. Greco-Roman rulers, Hellenistic rulers by and large, are really not interested in messing around with anybody's religion, with anybody's practices. If they can incorporate your gods with their gods, they're going to do it because they discovered if we leave you alone and let you pay your taxes and you pay your taxes and we can do whatever it is we want to do, life's better for us. It's not really that they're particularly cosmopolitan or anything like that. It's just, it's functionally better to just get your money and go. So he does what his ancestors did and what the Ptolemies did before him and what Alexander the Great did before him and what the Persians did before Alexander the Great, which is just leave everybody alone and let them pay their taxes. And the leave everybody alone and let them pay their taxes thing usually works, but sometimes it doesn't. And what's going on from 175 BCE until about 168 is that there are a series of guys who all serve as high priest. The first one that I've got listed, Tobias, at least the books of the Maccabees say he's a good high priest. The other two, Menelaus and Jason, kind of switch off as high priest, basically promising Antiochus more and more money, which Antiochus wants because he's fighting all these wars. So I have Vi here, and then I say in the parentheses, Vi equals promise money from the temple's treasury. That's where they're going to get it from. Um, think leverage buyout. You give me the temple, I'll give you the money from the temple, right? That's kind of how leverage buyout works, right? No one is exchanging any money. We're just going to secure all of these loans against stock. Same deal here. They go back and forth. And in the meantime, Antiochus is kind of fighting all of these military campaigns and needs the money. and he keeps going in and out of Judea. And so he needs the money. He's got these people who are trading off as high priest, promising these leveraged buyouts of the temple, essentially. That's the modern way of thinking about what's going on here. And then you have lots of Jews, particularly living in Jerusalem, who start to get kind of Greek, um, going to Greek schools, learning Greek language, adopting Greek names. And Menelaus and Jason are kind of Greek aligned. Tobias isn't, which is why the Book of Maccabees thinks he's a good guy. So you've got some Jews starting to do Greek things. You've got these guys who want to be priests because they want to be in charge, who are taking on Greek names. Jason is not a Hebrew name. Menelaus is not a Hebrew name. These are Greek names. You've got these guys wanting to kind of take hold, and you can kind of see there's going to be some kind of confrontation. And when it happens, what's it going to look like? And the answer is right around 167. These problems kind of all collide, right? The high priests fighting with each other is actually financially destabilizing because each time there's a new high priest, there's more money taken out of the temple's treasury, sent up to the Syrians, and somehow you have to run the local stuff too. You've got Hellenistically aligned Jews and more traditionally aligned Jews, and they're not getting along, and wars cost money. And when you put all of that together, something bad's going to happen. And eventually, things go south. And the answer to things go south from Antiochus's perspective is I need my money. You people are fighting over religion. The answer is to take your religion away. That's really what's probably going on. And so Antiochus kind of says, all right, high priest, you're not really, I'm keeping you in place, but I'm sending my soldiers. And we're going to take over the temple. We're going to take over lots of Jerusalem. Stop being Jewish. Stop doing Jewish things. Start doing Greek religious things. And rather than just apply to Jerusalem, it's everywhere. So it's every Jew everywhere. And that's what really starts the revolt, as best we can tell, in 167 in BCE in this place called Modi'in, which is 20 miles west of Jerusalem, roughly. Modi'in is almost halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, to give you kind of a sense of where it is in the country. So this is the outcome of not getting the money that is required and seeing that this situation just keeps kind of getting out of control. Okay, stop doing Jewish stuff. I'm in charge. You're going to do Greek religious things. That prompts the uprising. There are lots of battles. We don't really have to go into the battles. We don't have to go into the slew of Greek generals that managed to lose battles or win battles or, you know, um, can you fight wars on Shabbat? There's all kinds of interesting things that come up in the course of the Maccabean revolt, none of which are terribly important for what we really are going to talk about today. But you do kind of need to know where the conflict is coming from, and you kind of have to have a sense for time because the book of Daniel does care about time. So, oops, how do I do this? Okay, I want to go back one. Okay, so I want to go back two. So we just kind of want to keep the timeline around in our head a little bit. Alexander the Great's at 323. 168 is kind of when we're cooking up a war. And then 167 is when it really starts. Fast forwarding to 163 or 164 BCE, the dates are a little slippery. The Maccabees take and rededicate the temple. The education that most of us received stops here. We know that the Maccabees win, and therefore we get chocolate candy, right? That's the teaching. We don't do a great job at explaining to our students that no, actually, this conflict stretches on for another 20 odd years, and ultimately it turns into Jews having the standard um, Greco-Roman kingship and all of the standard things that go with it, and the bribery and the graft and the internecine conflict and the trying to make friends with Rome. All that we don't tell them all that stuff. We just kind of go, temple was rededicated. Here, have a dreidel. Um, Welcome to Jewish education, I guess. I don't know. That's what we tend to teach. So we can kind of see that at least the stuff that we talk about as part of the Maccabean revolt is all right. Jews suffered, let's eat. Right. The stuff we talk about with the Maccabean revolt is all in this like 3, 4 year period. Okay. That's the timeline. We only really need the timeline. We don't really need all of the background and when did Judah Maccabee die and when did this happen and when did that happen. We have information, but it's not so important for us. So this is the time frame. So let's talk about the book of Daniel, and it's a little bit of an abrupt shift. So before we kind of start into Daniel, are there questions about the timeline? Because I know I kind of, you know, elided a lot about the Maccabean revolt, but the details of the revolt actually aren't so important for understanding Daniel. They're very important if you want to understand the history of the Maccabean revolt. So if there are questions, unmute or throw a hand up or whatever works for you. Okay. So then let's head into Daniel a little bit. Overall structure of the book of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6 tell stories about a Jewish figure from Babylon named Daniel. There's not another, there's a reason it's called the book of Daniel. The book is ostensibly about the ongoing adventures of Daniel, also known as Shadrach. Okay. Um, so most of it's written in biblical Aramaic, really starting at Daniel 2, verse 4, halfway through the verse. Why is it in Aramaic? Yeah, Shadrach. So Deborah puts Shadrach in um, the chat box. You'd swap out the K for a CH usually. That's usually how it's spelled. But you'll hear about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are Daniel and two of his friends. Um, they are the three who get tossed into a fiery furnace, right? That's one of the stories that's in the book of Daniel is the thing about the furnace. We get the writing on the wall. That's also out of the book of Daniel. Daniel in the lion's den, book of Daniel. The language shifts from Hebrew to Aramaic because they're trying to provide an authentic feel to the story. They say, the king's magicians told him, colon, and they switch to Aramaic and they stay there for another 6 chapters. Second half of the book, starting with chapter 7, still claims to be either about or written by Daniel, is not like the first half of the book. First half of the book relates at least purportedly historical events. Daniel's got prophetic abilities. Daniel is able to advise the king. Daniel is able to do this. Daniel's able to do that. You get to chapter 7, and all of a sudden you shift, and you've got a bunch of complicated visions where Daniel says, I was standing in XYZ place, and I saw a vision. I heard voices, which sounds like the way prophets describe their experiences. So we have Isaiah and we have Jeremiah and we have Ezekiel talking in similar terms. I was standing in the temple one day, and then all of a sudden saw this creature with 4 faces, and its feet were wheels, and it's got wings, and one face is a lion, and one face is a man, and one face. Daniel kind of introduces these things, these visions the same way, but they're really not obvious. Like what it's saying is not super clear. And there's lots that involves money, that involves numbers and time and describing without describing people, describes animals and parts of animals, and it's weird. Like if you read it just unprepared, you're reading of something that's very strange. Um, it's mostly written in Hebrew. The first chapter is still in Aramaic because it seems to be like a continuation of what came before. But all of these chapters are very, very different from what came before. They just don't read the same way. And it's these chapters that are really the first example of mature, I guess is the way that you would put it, mature apocalyptic literature. We also are able to use this stuff to date the book of Daniel in a way that we can't do with any other biblical book. Because there's this section, particularly in chapter 8 of Daniel, where he describes events that are very obviously this is Alexander the Great, and these are the generals that come out of him, and this is supposed to be this person, and this is supposed to be that person. And so we get these verses that let us date the book. And they let us date the book because they let us know when the author of these sections of Daniel doesn't actually know what happens historically. Like we know exactly when he's wrong because we have other historical sources that clue us in. So this first verse that I've got excerpted says, Then the he goat grew very great. At the peak of his power, his big horn was broken. Right? And I have in brackets Alexander. This is Alexander the Great, and he dies. And in his place, four conspicuous horns, the four kingdoms that come up out of it, and their general geographic directions. It does not say Adelaide. Yeah, okay. Um, these four horns appear and they sprout toward the four winds of heaven, and then from one of them emerges a small horn, which extended itself toward the southeast and the beautiful land. Beautiful land, code word for Israel or Judea. So we know this is talking about Antiochus. And the reason we know is because the first half of chapter 8 speaks in these figurative terms, and the second half is the decoder ring part, where it says, here's what this means. And it parses it all out. So we don't have to guess at this one. There are other sections where we kind of do have to guess, except we don't really need to guess because we know what it's talking about. So we get this narrative of Alexander, four kingdoms, one particular king that's part of these four kingdoms. The regular offering was suspended and his holy place was abandoned. And there's only one person who does this. So this is kind of the other way you know this is Antiochus. No one has done this ever until the Romans kind of step in again. Oops. So that's, we kind of know based on this, okay, this is when Daniel is talking about. But Daniel doesn't actually report accurately anything about the end of the Maccabean revolt. This is how we know he's wrong. So in chapter 8, Daniel asks, how long will this be? How long will this period of oppression last? And the answer comes back 2,300 evenings and mornings, which is about 6 1/3 of a year. I already did the math for you. You don't have to worry about it. 6 1/3. Then the sanctuary will be clean. We know the revolt starts in 167, so you add 6 1/3 years and you get to like 162 or 161 BCE. And then it goes on. He will gain control over the treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and Cushites will follow at his heel. He will pitch his royal pavilion between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, and he will meet his doom with no one to help him. And this is where everything has gone sideways. Because what this is saying is that Antiochus will, at some point, lead a military incursion into the south, toward the west, take over Egypt, pull the Libyans, Libya, we know where Libya is, and the Cushites, which is in biblical language, other parts of Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, places like that. So it says he's going to go into Egypt and he's going to take over Egypt and he's going to take over Libya and he's going to have the Cushites following along too. And then he's going to try to do some other thing and he's going to die. Except he never goes back to Egypt. We know he never goes back to Egypt because both first and second Maccabees, so these Greek language Jewish historical texts, both say Antiochus dies in Persia, which is the other way from Egypt, right? So think Persia is mostly Iraq and Iran. He's the other way. He never goes back to Egypt. And First Maccabees at least says he died in the 149th year, and what they mean is of the Seleucid Empire, which starts in 312. So you do your math and you get to 163 BCE. And we have confirmation of this from Persian sources as well, right? Because we still unearth stuff out of the ground that's in clay tablets or whatever that are royal chronologies. We can read Akkadian, we can read Aramaic, we can read all these languages, so we're able to know when these events happen. So we have the book of Daniel saying this is going to end in about 162 or 161, and then we know that this guy dies on 164 or 163. So we know exactly how much the book of Daniel knows. It doesn't know this. And this is where it's wrong. We can't do this. This trick does not work with any other biblical book. It doesn't work with anything in the Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible. It doesn't work with anything in the New Testament. We can get sort of precise with the New Testament, but not within a year. And this is really within a year. We can put this text to within a year of a particular person's life. We can't really do that with any other biblical book. So this is really unique in and of itself that we can even do this kind of dating, right? This is the kind of thing that historians do all the time. We just don't normally have such precise information from a biblical book. And we do here. It's unusual. So we know when the book was done. Just we do. This is how we know. So Daniel knows about the start of the war, but he doesn't know about when everything ends. And so here we are with this very precisely datable book, unusually. It's just strange. So before we move on to why this all matters, questions about the Daniel stuff that we've talked about so far, or about the chronology, because I know I zipped through it a bit.
Not exactly a question per se, but I, at least just from the bit that I know of other books of, both the Tanakh and the New Testament, a lot of things tend to be written retroactively to like uh fulfill a prophecy. Is that right?
Right.
Whereas this is kind of written in the middle of things, which is fascinating. Um,
Yeah,
that's really cool.
it's a little different in a way that, boy, we can't do this with other texts. They scholars can be kind of accurate about things like when Paul's letters were written in the New Testament, but kind of accurate, like within 10 years, not within two. It's just very unusual and kind of cool, but it's really the exception. Kathy.
I'm confused about the relationship between the book of Daniel and the books of Maccabees.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the books of Maccabees, there are four books of Maccabees: first, second, third, and fourth Maccabees, or if you are the president-elect, one Maccabees, two Maccabees, three Maccabees, and four Maccabees, because he doesn't really understand the first versus the one. First and second Maccabees at least claim to be general historical texts about the Maccabean revolt, or maybe a little longer of a period of that war. Third Maccabees is actually not about anything that happens to the Maccabees at all. It's in Egypt. There's stories about elephants. It's not 100% clear how it even showed up. It's not even in the Catholic Bible. It's in certain Orthodox, um, Eastern Orthodox canons. Fourth Maccabees is sort of a long riff, philosophical riff on specific stories that we have in First and Second Maccabees. We're not looking at it because we're not really getting historical events. We're getting um, in-depth philosophical stuff from people who are reported to have been martyred. These books are all written in Greek, so you will not find them in a Tanakh, in a Jewish Bible. You will find them, First and Second Maccabees do appear in the Catholic canon. They do appear in Eastern Orthodox canon. They don't appear in Protestant canon. So if you pick up a Catholic Bible, you will find the Maccabees as just part of all the other historical books arranged in chronological order in what they would call the Old Testament. Same is true for Eastern Orthodox. If you pick up a Protestant Bible that says with Apocrypha, and only if it says with Apocrypha, you will find the four books of Maccabees, as well as a number of other things, in a section stuck between the Old Testament and the New Testament. They don't consider them canon, but some Protestants think that these are useful to look at, and so they get included in some way, shape, or form. We really wouldn't know very much about the Maccabean revolt, but for First and Second Maccabees and another work, the Jewish Antiquities and maybe a little bit of the Jewish War by a Jewish writer named Flavius Josephus, who you'll notice has a Latin name because he was originally a Jewish revolt leader during the revolt in 66 to 70, and then he eventually started working for the Romans. So that's kind of his story. So he writes these historical books, and he's using some historical resources that we don't have anymore. He's using some sources about these wars, a 5 volume set by someone named Jason of Cyrene. We no longer have these books, but Jason of Cyrene provides a lot more detail. Josephus tries to give us more detail, but he fundamentally agrees with what's in First and Second Maccabees. So we're kind of confident that these are about as right as you can get. So we don't have these books in our Bible. However, they're the only sources we have for what was going on for Jews at the time, or in any kind of detail. David, go ahead.
Presumably Daniel lived in the time of the exile. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
If Daniel was real, um, he would have lived during the exile. It seems, at least if you follow the characterization given him in the book of Daniel, that he was born in exile, right?
Yeah.
The exile lasted multiple generations, and he seems to have been born in exile. So sometime after 587, when some chunk of the Jews were moved out of Judea and into Persia.
Yeah. So that would be a good reason why he couldn't possibly have known certain things that happened at a, much later date, obviously. So doesn't it also show that the book of Daniel is really a compendium of different authors?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
there's almost no question that whatever is showing up in chapters 1 through 6 is not the same writer as chapters 7 through 12. Um, we go from Hebrew to Aramaic back to Hebrew. Um, so it can't really be the same person. It seems like the Aramaic is more for flavor than it had to be in Aramaic. There was more, this happened in Persia. We're going to switch to Aramaic now, which is something that happens in the book of Ezra for correspondence.
Yeah.
Greg.
So I'm not sure exactly the timing of when these books were all compiled, kind of formally, but was there an opportunity to kind of fix the timeline at some point that they could have, as they built out the formal library of books that became the could they have-
So,
Jeremy, could you repeat the question?
oh,
Because
so,
it was hard.
I'm sorry, I didn't have my microphone down. So
there it is.
I was eating, that's why my video was off. So basically, I'm not sure about the timing of when, the Hebrew Bible was kind of finalized, right? And was there an opportunity after the fact to go back to Daniel when compiling kind of the final version and maybe to fix it, to fix the timeline at that point?
Yeah, would there have been a chance to fix the timeline? So, in theory, there would have been. Because some of the books that make it into the Tanakh, right, that make it into the Jewish version of the Bible, they don't seem to make it until sometime in the first to second century CE. So we've got some time between when Daniel is finished and when those books were kind of fully brought in. But there's another thing that's at work here, which is that it's being treated as though it was really written by Daniel during the Babylonian exile. And therefore, it's not necessarily being connected by readers in the ancient world to the events of the Maccabean revolt. So they're not necessarily reading it as this is Alexander and this is Antiochus IV. They're reading it as Daniel's given us some far off projection of a future time. And we don't necessarily know when that's going to be. So they're not reading it that way, right? They're not trying to read it as they're not reading it with the mindset that we come to as modern people, that we come to this with modern people as, which is we want to know who wrote it and we want to know when it's from and we want to know who really wrote it because we don't really trust that the person whose name is on the book is the writer of the book. Because we know that in the ancient world, it was very normal to just stick the wrong name on a book because you were inspired by that person, or it seems like it might be from that time, or whatever. So we come at it that way. They do not come at it that way at all. And they just kind of figure this is about some future time. So there was probably plenty of opportunity to fix it, but they didn't think there was anything to fix because they didn't think it was talking about the things that we can kind of recognize that that's what the book is talking about. It's not that they weren't familiar with the history. They probably knew generally when things happened, although, when you read the Talmud, it's very clear that there's stuff that they're just way off about. But they just didn't think there was anything wrong with it because they didn't think it was about the Maccabees. They just thought it was about the far future.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so Bernard Bamberger's Fallen Angels surveys all kinds of interesting things from the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. Um, Kind of the current um, dean, I guess you'd put it, of studies of apocalyptic literature, particularly Jewish apocalyptic literature in the biblical period, is a professor named John Collins, who I believe is at Yale Divinity School right now. Um, so John Collins, there's another one named Joseph Baumgartner who is a Catholic priest. Catholic priests are big into this area of literature when they're biblical scholars. I think Baumgartner might have been at Catholic University for a while. So we have some good interpreters, and we kind of know, okay, this is what Daniel knows about, and this is where the timeline goes off. And so we know where Daniel's gone wrong. But again, ancient readers didn't think Daniel was wrong. They just didn't think he was talking about the Maccabees, where we can kind of see the events and the timeline and say, oh, this is definitely about the Maccabees, and this is definitely 159 years after Alexander. For sure, we know it because we can do the math and figure it out. Other questions? Fallen Angels is from the 50s. Yeah, there's been lots and lots and lots of research. I mean, we kind of knew modern scholarship kind of knew this stuff about Daniel really in the 1800s, but there's continued study and we understand more about Aramaic as a language, and we understand more about the history of Persia. It's really only in the last, I don't know, 40, probably the last 40 years where Jewish scholars started learning Farsi in order to be able to start to incorporate Persian history and Persian religious studies into the work of biblical scholarship and the history of Jewish thought. So we don't have a long time working with these other texts. And so what we see in 1950s scholarship has been refined and improved upon and all of that stuff. So it's always good to kind of see, is there a latest edition? And I think John Collins's book is like in its fourth edition or something like that. He's spruced it up several times over the last 30 odd years. Okay. So I've mentioned that Daniel is apocalyptic literature and that this is a world-changing kind of thing. So let's talk about what it is and why it is. And apocalyptic literature almost always involves war, and so it was very convenient that um, the artificial intelligence thing that's built into PowerPoint provided me with this particular image of a very elaborate breastplate. Probably more elaborate than would have been worn in the ancient world, but still, you know, it seemed appropriate. So, first, the name. Apocalypse is really from two Greek words, apo, which is usually a prefix, which means from or away, or right? Undo, whatever. And then kaluptein, which means to hide. Now you'll notice that I just said kaluptein and it says apocalyptic with a Y. Um, Ancient Greek doesn't have a Y, it has a U. It's hupsilon, but it's written like a Y. It becomes our Y. It eventually moves to a pronunciation that's like our Y in Greek. They lose the U sound and they get this E sound. So apocalypse, it's the same letter, it's the upsilon. Um, so apocalypse means unhidden, which means that an apocalypse, there's a lot of possible meanings for the word apocalypse itself. It can be a specific apocalyptic prophecy. It can be a literary work with apocalyptic material in it, or it can be an event, right? We talk about the apocalypse or this hurricane unleashed an apocalypse upon the residents of city X, right? But they're all kind of coming out of the same place, which is the result of some information that's been hidden away that the author of the material is disclosing. He is unhiding it. He's not decoding it necessarily, right? So, look, we live near relatively close to Fort Meade, so we know that the NSA is there and does cryptography. You'll notice that it's not apocryptos, it's not uncoded, it is unhidden. So the author is disclosing it and interpreting it. There are really four characteristics. I cannot do justice to the four characteristics lecture that my Hebrew Bible professor gave. It really is 30 years ago now. Um, but it is actually 30 years ago. I took my first Hebrew Bible class in the fall of 1994. So that's the math. Um, his lecture was really good. Um, but basically, apocalyptic literature has a radically dualistic view of the world with good and evil radically opposed to each other. It's concerned with eschatology. So eschatology is study of the end times. So it is concerned with the idea that we're going to get to an end of history and good people will be rewarded, bad people will be punished. This world will utterly change. Right? So this is not a philosophy of the world is bad, fix it. Our job is to fix it and make it better. This is a philosophy of the world is broken. It really can't be fixed. And its end is coming soon. And it will radically change because God is going to step in and blow it all up. Right? That is the eschatological perspective. Symbolic language that's either explained by the author or is going to be understood by the author's intended audience at the time, and that presents and interprets world events through symbology. So we already read Daniel talking about horns, and there's a goat, and it's got a big horn, and the big horn breaks because the goat dies, and then there's four smaller horns, but they're still pretty big. And one of those four horns generates a smaller horn, right? We're talking about people as though they're horns, but we can kind of figure out what's happening. And then the sort of fourth quasi attribute is that it's pseudepigraphal, which is a big word that just means the guy who says he wrote it isn't the guy who wrote it. So Daniel probably, if Daniel lived, if the Daniel described in the beginning of the book of Daniel actually lived, he couldn't have written this book because it's describing events he couldn't have known about, so it got attributed to him. So these are sort of the 4 plus 1/2 attributes of apocalyptic literature. This is not the same as prophetic literature, even though there's stuff that's shared in common. So if you read Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, they offer views of an ideal future. And most of what they offer is actually not the world's going to end. Daniel is offering this world is horrible and it's going to end. Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and all these other prophets, the prophets whose work is in the prophets, in that section of the Tanakh, most of what they have to say is not the world is going to end because we were bad. It is the world is pretty broken. We have to fix it. We need to do better. It's our fault. or it's the Egyptians' fault, or it's whoever's fault. Because they also usually prophesy that it will be fixed. There are parts of um, Isaiah in particular that seem to have more of a the world's going to end thing, but they don't have the symbolic language and the they don't have quite the black and white split to the world that we're really seeing in something like Daniel. So apocalyptic literature is really symbolic, generated by people who see themselves as oppressed right now. And the oppression is so bad that they think the world's going to end soon. Whereas prophetic literature kind of thinks you can fix this. Yeah, sure, people may die and bad things are going to happen, and we have to find ways of explaining that. But for the prophets, the job is we've done something wrong, we have to fix it. That's not the job for apocalyptic literature. The job for apocalyptic literature is for good people to tough it out. And they may die, but they're going to be rewarded eventually. Right? So it doesn't even try to pretend that the world can be okay. And that's a really big change. And it happens because all these other approaches to divine justice fail. But we've been good. Why are we suffering? Right? This is kind of the classic, why do bad things happen to good people question. The prophets say bad things happen to good people because the guy next to you is a bad person and he's causing bad things to happen to you. And we can maybe fix the world. You may not see it, but we can fix the world. Apocalyptic literature's answer is bad things happen to good people because there are bad people in the world. We can't fix that. Don't worry, you're going to get credit for this in the world to come. And no kidding, I had a professor in college who would ask people to answer questions during class, and he would say for credit in the world to come. That really is the philosophy of apocalyptic literature is world's broken, can't fix it. God's going to intervene in a massive way at some point to fix it. You'll be resurrected. Don't worry. You will get the things you deserve to get, right? There's this sticker that you sometimes see on cars. May you have the day you deserve, right? Not have a good day, but have the day you deserve. Apocalyptic literature says you will eventually have the day that you deserve. It's going to happen soon, but in the meantime, this world is not great. So that's what apocalyptic literature does is it takes this broken world and it says, God's going to fix it later and he's going to end history. Not the Francis Fukuyama version of the end of history. I don't know if anybody even remembers that guy anymore. Yeah, that was like the end of the Cold War. He kind of thought something else was going to happen. He wasn't an apocalyptic prophet. He just kind of thought that the end of the Cold War disrupts all of these typical patterns of history. And it turns out he wasn't right. So we'll just kind of set Francis Fukuyama off to one side. But that's what's happening with apocalyptic literatures. We're just going to have this rupture. And we have to, that's the theological move that has to happen when you can't make the world right. And you insist on God's going to fix it. You just kind of have to like kick this can down the road, essentially. Is there apocalyptic literature other than Daniel? Daniel's like the minority on apocalyptic literature. I know the text is a little small. I can send you the slides at some point if you want. There's lots of Jewish apocalyptic literature. There's lots of Christian apocalyptic literature. Good chunks of the Dead Sea Scrolls are apocalyptic. So I don't necessarily recommend reading the Dead Sea Scrolls unless you're super interested because I took a whole seminar on it and I thought it was boring, like watching paint dry. It's supposed to be very, very exciting, and all the TV specials from the 90s made them seem very interesting, and I just wasn't into it. But there are several Dead Sea Scrolls that are apocalyptic literature. The whole thing is apocalyptic literature. So there's a scroll that's sometimes called the War Rule, but it's usually called the War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. It's a full-fledged description of an apocalypse and how the righteous people should fight this war. So it's got rules about warfare that are interesting kind of on their own, but it's describing an apocalypse. There's a text called the Aramaic Apocalypse. Guess what language it's written in? There is the Genesis Apocryphon, which takes specific passages from the book of Genesis and interprets them as though they are apocalyptic prophecies. So there's all kinds of interesting stuff hanging around in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are a number of these other non-canonical books, First, Second, and Third Enoch, which actually does appear in some Ethiopian religious texts as canonical. These have apocalyptic passages in them and prophecies. There's a whole series of apocalypses that are named after figures in the Hebrew Bible. So there's an apocalypse of Abraham that supposedly was written by Abraham, and there's an apocalypse of Moses, supposedly written by Moses, and then there's an apocalypse of some more minor figures. And then there's passages from books that fall into the books in the prophetic section of the Hebrew Bible that have apocalyptic themes, right? The world is going to end and it's fundamentally broken and there's dualism or whatever it is, but they don't use the symbolic language. They're not trying to disguise historical events in other terms. They don't necessarily see that the world's ending right away, but they do kind of have a world ending idea floating around in them. So they're not full-fledged, mature apocalyptic literature. They just kind of have some of that content to them. Then there's Christian apocalyptic literature. Lots of chunks of the New Testament. So Matthew 24 and Mark 13, they're really parallel chunks of text. Directly quote parts of Daniel to talk about an end time. The entire book of Revelation is an apocalypse, right? This is where we get the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That's not from Daniel, it's from Revelation. When you hear about Christians who want Jews to return to Israel because there would be a remnant of 120,000 Jews, the remnant idea is from the book of Revelation. That's where this stuff is coming out of. And then there's other Christian literature, again, not part of the New Testament, that is apocalyptic as well. So the apocalypse of Paul and some other things attributed to other church fathers. There's some amount of dispute about some of these Jewish apocalyptic works. It's not 100%. Not everybody is convinced that they're Jewish. Some people think that these are actually kind of Christian texts, but they're sneaking it in. They don't talk about Jesus, but there's other arguments being made. So there's lots of other apocalyptic literature. Very little of it makes it into a Bible because too many of them turn out to be wrong. They're too precise and they go wrong, or there's other stuff wrong with those texts. So particularly this body, these Christian non-canonical apocalypses, don't make it in because there's something theologically wrong in them. A lot of the time, they don't really buy into the idea of the Trinity, and that knocks them out. There's a lot of possible things going on. Early Christian literature is an interesting hodgepodge of things that we definitely won't worry too much about. But they definitely have apocalyptic literature. There's a lot of it out there. So this is stuff that's from the New Testament. This is a chunk of Matthew 24. I said Matthew 24 is one of the apocalypses. So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel, he's just quoting Daniel. When you see the desolating sacrilege, which is Antiochus's destruction of the temple. So Daniel is talking about Antiochus. The New Testament is clearly not thinking that the book of Daniel is about 170 years before the New Testament's events, thinks it's talking about sometime in the future. So it's taking the language of Daniel. When you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Immediately after suffering, the days of the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Quoting Daniel. So this is Christian apocalyptic literature that depends on the book of Daniel and is reinterpreting what Daniel talks about to be about Jesus. This is the Son of Man is Jesus. Jesus refers to himself through the New Testament, through the Gospels, as the Son of Man, right? Uses this title that appears the first time that we really see it in Daniel. Son of Man imagery is really common. The Gospels use it, Revelation uses it. I'm not going to tell you to correct your friends when they say revelations, but it is not revelations. It is revelation. It's one revelation. This is John of Patmos, who is the author of the book of Revelation, whoever John of Patmos was. This is John of Patmos saying that he had a single vision beamed into his head that he's then laying out for everybody. With 12 gates into Jerusalem, and they're made of gems, and 120,000 Jews remaining, and they all become Christians, and there's a lake of fire, and the four horsemen, right? This is all whatever happened in John of Patmos's head. And we don't really know exactly what historical events he's trying to interpret, but he's definitely writing an apocalypse, but it is revelation. Or if you really want to come do it cleanly, you call it the apocalypse of John, and then you just avoid this whole revelations thing. Or you can also avoid the reformed thing. It's Reform Judaism. The number of people I talk to say, well, my family's reformed. Like, reformed into what? Oh, you mean you're Reformed Jews? Okay. These are the things that get in people's craws, right? So it's revelation, and they grab stuff right out of Daniel. So we know what's happening. We know that they're really working from Daniel and reinterpreting Daniel's imagery. So another example, Revelation 22. So this is the last chapter of the book of Revelation, by the way. Then he told me, do not seal up the words of this prophecy of the scroll, because the time is near, right? This is one of the hallmarks of apocalyptic literatures. The end's coming. Let the one who does wrong continue to do wrong. Let the vile person continue to be vile. Let the one who does right continue to do right. And let the holy person continue to be holy. We're not going to fix the world. If you're a good person, keep being good. If you're a bad person, we don't care about you. You're about to be melted into nothing, right? That's the premise of apocalyptic literature. And this philosophy isn't only in, for Christians, is not only in straight up apocalyptic literature like the book of Revelation. So the Apostle Paul has written a whole bunch of different letters that are in the New Testament. Have you ever heard the phrase better to marry than to burn? Right. So some people are nodding and some people are like, what is that? So the Apostle Paul I think it's in Corinthians, but I could be wrong about the First Corinthians, but I could be wrong about the letter, is talking about that the end is coming soon. And really, you should just keep your life the way it is. There's no reason for you to deviate in any particular way because the end is coming. God is going to intervene. Don't really get crazy about opposing the Roman forces. Just pay your taxes. Don't really get crazy about getting in fights with your neighbors. Don't really worry too much about missionizing, right? The end is coming. And then he says, but look, if you're going to engage in sexual immorality, you will become a bad person and you will burn in the coming apocalypse. Get married. Better to marry than to burn. Paul is not writing apocalyptic literature, but these ideas are central to Christianity at his time. They think the end is coming. And so this expression, better to marry than to burn, is a picture, is based on this idea that bad people are fundamentally bad, good people are fundamentally good. They shouldn't deviate from their courses. But if you're a good person, if you're a Christian, and the temptation is just too much, you should get married. Because the alternative is that you become a bad person and you're no longer a Christian and you're going to burn. That is literally the better to marry than to burn. That is what it's about. It is taking these apocalyptic ideas and turning them into life advice, pastoral advice for Christians living in 50 CE. We should really like, but then all of that advice gets pulled forward for 2000 years, right? So better to marry than to burn is a thing you'd hear in churches today too. Like a pastor would say, better to marry than to burn as advice to a parishioner. You won't hear me say that. I mean, like in this context where I'm talking about the New Testament, sure, but like I'm not going to give that kind of advice. That's kind of crazy. Greg, you have your.
Yeah, quick question. Just a comment from the previous slide about the Son of Man. I don't know if you mentioned, doesn't is in Ezekiel, um, God calls him Son of Man when he refers to him. So I don't know if
Yeah, and so this is interesting. Some of Ezekiel isn't from Ezekiel, which is to say, Ezekiel as a prophet spans both the existence and non-existence of the temple in Jerusalem. And so there's language directed at Ezekiel, son of man. Ezekiel probably is some kind of quasi-contemporary to Daniel from the first half of the book of Daniel, where son of man's used a bunch of times. Um, there's a shift somehow in the use of son of man, and it turns into a title. And it seems to turn into a title with the second half of Daniel. So I said this is the first time where Son of Man is used, and that's really not 100% accurate. But as a title that means something different, that's Daniel's its first use. And then it really becomes important in the New Testament because it's the title that Jesus takes upon himself. One of the things that is, just to kind of hit it quickly, when you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the ones that are actually in the New Testament, the ones that made it. There are other gospels that didn't. You can find them in other books. When you read those gospels, one of the things that you'll see is that Jesus is very cagey when asked if he's the Messiah. He doesn't tend to say, I am. He tends to say things like, what do you say I am? Or refer to himself in the third person as the Son of Man, rather than saying, I'm the Son of God, right? Which is what Christianity eventually does with that. So the Son of Man thing is sort of its own kind of quasi-messianic title. It's not exactly a messianic title because Jesus sort of plays around with it to say, oh, it's like plausible deniability almost in some of these passages. do you think you're the Messiah? Do you think you're the Son of God? Do you think you're the Messiah? Are you the King of Kings? You say that I am, right? It's like he's got a lawyer next to him, kind of going, you don't have to incriminate yourself. It's not necessarily going to help you to deny, but you don't have to incriminate yourself, right? That's how the Fifth Amendment works, right? You don't have to incriminate yourself, but it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good when you walk around calling yourself the Son of Man, but that's what Jesus does.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm remembering some lines from Jesus Christ Superstar where it plays out like you're describing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So some of these musicals, by the way, are actually pretty good at conveying some of this. Jesus Christ Superstar, Godspell, um, because Godspell really closely tracks the Gospel of Matthew. So if you want something that actually does a pretty good job getting you the content of the Gospel of Matthew, you could do worse than Godspell. In fact, some of the ways you could do worse than Godspell would be by watching some of the stuff that goes on to Christian TV, because not all of it's great either. Irony is not always fundamentalist Christianity's strong suit, I guess is what I would say. Not intentional irony, anyway. Um, so I mentioned apocalypses don't seek change. Then a lot of apocalyptic literature sort of has this predestinarian thing going on. They don't think you can fix everything. And they tend to have this feeling that, like, God has decided where you're going already, right? Because God knows everything, so God can decide everything. That's the idea. God knows where you're going already. You'll have to see. And that becomes very important, particularly within Christianity, and fuels theological debates in Christianity all the way down to today. Judaism doesn't tend to grab onto that theme nearly as much. This predestinarian thing isn't something that comes up much in Jewish thought, but it's central in Christianity. So this whole let the good person continue to be good and the bad person continue to be bad, that's part of apocalyptic thought, never really grabs hold in Judaism, but Christianity really does grab onto it and it becomes a problem. Um, like really an enduring problem within Catholicism, within Protestantism, like entire sects of Protestantism exist because somebody decided that people were predestined and it caused a rift in that particular church. And now you've got the Baptists on one side of the street who think that everybody's predestined to go someplace, and the Baptists on the other side of the street who don't think so. Joyce.
Yeah, it just struck me when you were talking about the prophets versus the people, the apocalyptics, that the prophets were more like humanists because they were saying, yes, we can fix it. We can do something about it.
Yeah,
And
or at
they,
least that we were supposed to do something about it, right?
right,
Yeah.
they seem
Um,
sort of more optimistic somehow.
yeah, the prophets think that the world can be better, and apocalyptic literature just doesn't actually think that. It thinks that the world has to be totally wiped away. And you can kind of see where traditional Judaism lands on this, right? The rabbis kind of say, if somebody comes and says them that the Messiah has come and you're planting a tree, finish planting the tree. Then go meet the Messiah. Because one, we can't necessarily trust the prophecy, but two, the world's not necessarily irredeemable. So Christianity doesn't really pick up that thread in the same way. Where do you get these ideas? Because these are new in some ways to Judaism when they come up with Daniel. Um, you kind of have to remember by the time you get to the Maccabean revolt, Jews have been living in the Greek world for almost 2 centuries. There are Jews with both Hebrew and Greek names, and it's not uncommon, right? So I mentioned these priests, Jason and Menelaus. What's notable about them is that not that they have Greek names, but that they primarily go by the Greek name, as opposed to whatever their Hebrew name was. Menelaus may have been Moshe, right? Jason may have been Yonatan, we don't know, but we know that they're not remembered by Hebrew names or by Aramaic names. They're remembered by their Greek names. So encounters with Hellenistic culture, because Hellenistic culture means that Greek philosophy's kind of in the water. And particularly the philosophy of Plato has this notion that there's an ideal world and there's this world, which is sort of a weird reflection and imperfect reflection of the ideas, of the forms. So the idea that the world we're in is actually not the perfect world or the best possible world, that's part of Plato, essentially. So it's part of Greek culture, which means it's part of Jewish culture at this time. Encounters with Persian culture, Zoroastrianism dates to about 2,600 years ago. And Zoroastrian culture also has this kind of dualism, but its dualism is a sharp distinction between good and evil. That rather than have a single God, that Zoroastrianism essentially has a good God and a bad God, and they are always at odds with each other. And that's sort of coming into apocalyptic literature as things like the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness, right? It's like right in the name of that particular Dead Sea Scrolls, that particular kind of dualism. So there's this Hellenistic dualism of there's the world that is, and then there's this ideal world, and then there's the Persian dualism that comes out of Zoroastrianism of good and evil are just radically different. And when you put all of that together, you get a heaven and a hell. When in the past, you wouldn't have had heaven and hell. What you would have had was sort of a shadowy underworld, right? That Judaism has Sheol, and Sheol is really not fundamentally different from Hades. Lots of cultures have this, that there's not really hell exactly. It's being dead's depressing for everybody, essentially. Um, that's the idea of an afterlife until you start to get Hellenism and Zoroastrianism combining and coming through Judaism, and then you start to get these sorts of heaven hell splits. Prophetic literature has some of this stuff. There are prophets who speak in figurative terms. So definitely everybody's favorite is the prophet Hosea. Um, those who haven't read the prophet Hosea, I'm not going to say you're in for a treat if you read him. However, Hosea basically seems to have been told or think he's been told by God that what he should do is marry a prostitute and have children with the prostitute. And the children are named things that in Hebrew translate out to things that are bad about the Jewish people at the time. Um, like, so you don't want to say that Hosea is living his best life because he's not. You know, take a woman, take a woman of ill repute and have children, and he's giving them these names, and they're really awful names. And the point is probably not that Hosea was actually doing it, but that this is figurative language intended to get across to the Israelites at the time how bad they are. But the figurative language is something that then filters into apocalyptic literature. And then evolution of Jewish views of theodicy, which we just talked about, the idea that it gets really hard to tell somebody over and over and over again, I know that these bad things keep happening, but don't worry, it's going to be okay. We can fix it. At a certain point, you don't believe that anymore. And so you have to answer the question, okay, do I believe that this can be fixed or not? Do I believe that God is actually controlling the world or not? And what apocalyptic literature does is it takes that is God controlling the world thing and kicks the can down the road. effectively and says, it's all going to be fixed in the end. Don't worry about it. In the afterlife, right? That's the answer. And it's also kind of shifting how theodicy works in Judaism. So if you go and read Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is really thinking about if you all, as the Israelites, do the right thing, you're going to prosper and be able to stay in the land of Israel. And if you don't, you're getting kicked out. It's not about what any individual person does or any individual person's fate. By the time we get to Daniel, there really has not been an independent Jewish anything, an independent Israelite anything for 350 years or so. They've constantly been under somebody's thumb. They haven't really been independent. Even if you do have a leader, you're really a vassal to somebody else. You're not on your own and you're not doing well. And yeah, this isn't working. It's hard to have the continued discussion about we're going to get our land back. We're going to get our land back. Yeah, when? So then, are you a good person is supposed to then matter in your individual life. And it becomes okay, if you're a good person, you'll prosper. But then you can see that that doesn't work either. If good people prosper and bad people suffer, why the heck is it that the people that we put in the temple can misbehave and end up in charge? And I have nothing, right? So then the next step becomes kick it to the world to come. So when you put all of these together, you get this eschatological end of the world thing. And so that's where the ideas are really coming out of. There's all of these different streams that meet at this one particular time in this one particular crisis during the Maccabean revolt and shift Jewish thought and create a body of literature that is absolutely necessary for Christianity to exist. Because Christianity depends on the idea that there's going to be an end. You're going to have a reward or punishment at the end of days. It's going to be based on how you lived your life today. And for early Christians, that end was soon, which they're getting out of apocalyptic literature. So it all works. And you don't have Christianity without it, right? Because you don't even have Jesus being able to describe himself as the Son of Man coming with the clouds. And look at the prophecy of the book of Daniel. When you see the thing from the book of Daniel happen, that's how you know that it's time for you to move to this place. And there is no Christianity without the book of Daniel, which means there's no Christianity without the Maccabean revolt. Pretty much. I mean, that's pretty much a necessary component. I won't say that it's a sufficient component for Christianity, but it's definitely a necessary component for Christianity. You really do have to have this apocalyptic kind of thing happening in order to develop what Christianity starts as and becomes. Because if you stop and think about it, part of Christianity's theological premise is Jesus died on the cross. Wait, this guy was supposed to be the Messiah. Now what? Oh, he's going to come back. That's the Son of Man coming with the clouds. That guy's going to be back. We're going to have an apocalypse. You have to have some way of doing that. You have to have some kind of conceptual framework that allows you to say Jesus will be back. And you don't have it without Daniel saying there's going to be an end time and giving the language to then be able to allow the New Testament to pull that and move it forward. And that is how the Maccabean revolt changed the world. And the final slide went up oh, see, now it's 8:28, 2 minutes before the 8:30 stop time that was listed on the calendar. And somehow miraculously, not really miraculously, but just I have finally stuck the landing on the timing on a Thinking Tuesday.